Hello and welcome back. As we have learned from previous videos, the 1900s were a time of both innovation and struggle for America. We left off on the Great Depression, which left most Americans dealing with just trying to get by and feed their families. There were two groups, however, that struggled beyond the troubles of the economy. Those two groups were women and African Americans. Their struggles were very different, but both boiled down to fighting for equality. We have 4 learning targets for today. First, I can explain the women's suffrage movement. I can describe the civil rights movement. I can define desegregation and integration. And finally, I can explain massive resistance. Let's start with the first group, women. For the United States' entire history, they had been excluded from voting. This included women of all races. To understand this, we have to think about the typical family dynamic of the time period. Women didn't work for the most part, although this began to change as a result of World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. It was expected that a woman got married, had children, and took care of the household. Women were not in charge of their finances and had to rely on their husband or father for money most of the time. As a result, much of society felt that women didn't need to vote and that their husband would vote on behalf of the family. Like I said, though, times were changing. Women were needed in the workforce during the wars due to much of the workforce going overseas to war. And then when the Great Depression hit, families needed everyone working if they could just to get by. Women began to feel empowered, realizing that they had the ability to do more than just what was expected of them. Women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Sojourner Truth led the suffrage movement, arguing that women didn't necessarily hold the same opinions as their husband and should be able to vote for themselves. This movement, while focused on getting women the right to vote, was about women's equality. Ultimately, the U.S. Constitution was amended again for a 19th time in 1920, giving women the right to vote. This was a big win and showed that when a group of people banded together for a common cause, that real change was possible. That hope for change wasn't only felt by women. Like I said, African Americans had spent years having their rights taken away and being treated as less than. In our last unit, we talked about segregation and how the Supreme Court of the United States had legalized it by ruling that separate but equal facilities were legal. Unfortunately, we know that there was nothing equal about the public facilities provided for Black people. By the mid-20th century, more and more Black people were beginning to actively fight for equal rights. In Virginia, Barbara Johns was one of the most well-known figures for standing up to the deplorable conditions she was expected to endure in order to go to school. Johns led hundreds of other students in a strike on their Farmville High School, R.R. Moton High, and brought her case before the Virginia courts. Her case, Davis versus Prince Edward County, looked to rule that separate but equal was in fact unequal, and that students should be able to go to their neighborhood schools regardless of their race. In this case, a 3-judge panel struck down the lawsuit, finding that Black students weren't being treated unfairly and upholding state separate but equal. Things didn't look good, but it wasn't over yet. One of the lawyers involved in the case was Oliver Hill Sr. He was a civil rights attorney from Richmond, Virginia. We know him for his involvement in this case, but he also helped with landmark decisions on equal pay for Black teachers, access to school buses, voting rights, and employment protection. Although he lost the Davis versus Prince Edward County case, one of the most important legal options people have is to appeal, and that's what he planned to do. He wasn't going to let segregation stand in public schools. Davis versus Prince Edward County was combined with 4 other cases, all seeking to end segregation in public schools. In the landmark case, Brown versus Board of Education. If you recall, the last time the U.S. Supreme Court took up the issue of separate but equal, they ruled that it was legal in the Plessy versus Ferguson case. That was in 1896. This case was heard in 1954, almost 60 years later, and the Supreme Court struck down segregation in schools for good. With this decision, all public schools in the United States were ordered to integrate, meaning that students would attend their neighborhood school regardless of race. This was a major win for people of color across the country. It's never that easy, though. When schools were ordered to integrate, some did so without trouble. Many, however, fought back. In Virginia, a man named Harry F. Byrd Sr. was about to make a name for himself opposing the Supreme Court's decision. Back in 1926, Byrd was Virginia's governor. If you think about that time period, it was right around the Great Depression. Byrd opposed President Roosevelt's New Deal, saying that it made the federal government too powerful, and he worried a powerful government would lead to the downfall of segregation. During his time as governor, Byrd maintained a balanced budget and created a pay-as-you-go plan for building new roads in Virginia. He refused to put the state into debt, so as they had funds available, they would put it towards roads. After his time as governor, he was elected as a senator for Virginia. It was during this time that schools were ordered to integrate. Byrd did not believe in integration and encouraged school systems to refuse to desegregate, and several other senators across the South followed his lead. This widespread and organized refusal to integrate is known as massive resistance. White families across the country were angry at the thought of sending their children to the same school as black children, and they weren't afraid to show it. They stood outside of schools that were integrating, yelling at black children as they entered, sometimes threatening them. Many white families simply didn't send their children to school or removed them and enrolled in private schools. Private schools who didn't have to follow this federal mandate grew in huge popularity as white families with the money to afford it enrolled their children. In some instances, public school systems actively refused to integrate, and their local government supported them, even though they were going against federal law. Right here locally, Norfolk Public Schools closed down entirely for a whole school year rather than integrating. Schools weren't the only form of segregation that people were fighting against during this time period. Rosa Parks is famous for refusing to give up her seat on a bus in Alabama in 1955, but years before that, in 1944, a similar protest by Irene Morgan, a black Virginian, also made headlines. Morgan was a Rosie the Riveter in Baltimore, Maryland. She had been visiting her mother in Virginia and boarded a bus in Gloucester County. Feeling ill, she took a seat near the back for her ride home. Virginia law said that the white bus driver could make her move to the very far back of the bus, but when he ordered to do it, she would not budge. Morgan was arrested and found guilty, so she appealed her conviction. The Virginia Supreme Court sided with the Virginia law, but in 1946, the U.S. Supreme Court said the law was unfair. This ruling was an important civil rights victory. Even though it applied only to travel from one state to another, not to travel inside a single state, until Rosa Parks took her famous ride several years later, states could still have segregated buses. Through two terrible wars, black soldiers had fought and died for America. Black mothers had lost sons, black children their fathers. Now, as an uneasy peace settled over the world, African Americans were still treated poorly. In the 1940s and 1950s in Virginia, as in most of the South, blacks could not use the same schools, restaurants, bathrooms, water fountains, public parks, beaches, or swimming pools as used by whites. They had to sit in separate waiting rooms, in the backs of buses, and in stuffy balconies in movie theaters. Black Virginians had fought to improve their segregated schools. Now they began working for an end to segregation in the schools. While they were at it, they broadened their fight to include equal opportunities in jobs and housing, along with the right to vote. Civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. believed that the best way to change things was in peaceful, nonviolent ways. Inspired by Dr. King, Virginians began to hold protests, sit-ins, and marches to call attention to all the unfair practices in the Jim Crow South and to finally change the years and years of discrimination. At Thalheimer's, Richmond's biggest department store, black customers could not eat in the restaurant. In 1960, students at nearby Virginia Union University decided to protest by holding a sit-in at Thalheimer's and other stores. They filled every seat and waited to be served, refusing to leave until they were treated with respect. They did not react when white customers taunted them or shoved them. For trespassing and failing to leave when asked to, 34 students were arrested. Their classmates picketed the store, urging black customers to boycott, to not shop there. After many weeks, the stores finally gave in and changed their policy of discrimination. Across Virginia, African Americans, especially students, heeded Dr. King's call for passive resistance. Using peaceful means, marches, pickets, boycotts, and sit-ins, they sang "We Shall Overcome" and made their voices heard. But peaceful protests turned violent in Danville, Virginia during the summer of 1963 when a nonviolent march led by high school students ended with the students being beaten and arrested by police. When their parents came to the police station to pick up their kids, they too were arrested for contributing to the delinquency of a minor. It was so frustrating. On the opposite end of the spectrum of Governor Harry Byrd, Lynwood Holton would become governor later on. He believed strongly in integrating schools. In fact, instead of sending his children to private school, he enrolled them in integrated public schools in Richmond. Not only was he a proponent of integration, he also worked towards equality for all. He is known for hiring more women and people of color than any governor before him. In 1990, Virginia elected its first African American governor, L. Douglas Wilder. Wilder was actually the first African American governor in any state in the U.S. since the Reconstruction era. The grandson of former slaves, Wilder studied chemistry in college, planning to be a doctor. But after serving in the Korean War, he went to law school instead. In 1969, he was elected the first black state senator in Virginia since the 1880s. Maggie Lena Walker was born in Richmond as Maggie Lena Mitchell soon after slavery ended. She was the first African American woman, black or white, to become a bank president in the United States. Quite an accomplishment for a woman who joked that she was born with a laundry basket on her head. When she was still a child, Walker's dad was killed. Her mom kept the family going by starting a laundry service, and young Maggie went to work helping her mother. As a teenager, she joined the Grand United Order of St. Luke, a group that built racial pride, and soon became one of its leaders. She taught in the new black schools for a while, but when she married Armstead Walker, she had to quit since married women were not allowed to teach. Mrs. Walker still wanted to help others, so she decided to start a small bank. In 1968, Richmond native Arthur Ashe won the U.S. Open. He was the first African American to win a major men's tennis championship. It had been a long, hard journey to reach that wonderful moment, and it was just the beginning. In the 1950s, when Arthur Ashe was a child, all of Richmond's schools, restaurants, and parks were racially segregated. All he wanted was to play tennis, but he wasn't allowed on any of the public courts. Luckily, he found a place to play at an African American tennis club. Ashe practiced hard. He traveled to parts of America where he could play against white athletes. He won a college scholarship to the University of California in Los Angeles, where he won a national tennis championship. After graduating in 1965, he went on to win the U.S. Open in 1968, the Australian Open in 1970, and Wimbledon in 1975. At the height of Arthur Ashe's career, tragedy struck. He had a heart attack and had to stop playing. He became an author and began to speak out against racial injustice. He traveled all over the world giving speeches and fighting for social change and equality. It seemed like maybe losing tennis was the push he needed to get him into social justice. Then tragedy struck again. After an operation on his heart, Ashe learned that he had been infected with the HIV virus from a bad blood transfusion. He died on February 6, 1993, leaving behind a great legacy. Today, we remember Ashe as an eloquent spokesperson for social change and racial equality, a man who turned a tennis racket into an instrument for a better world.